You're listening to Lights Camera Latino, the podcast, hosted by Ángel Fabián Rivera. Remember to follow us on our social media platforms as Lights Camera Latino and Ángel Fabián Rivera. Hola mi gente, welcome to Lights Camera Latino, the podcast. This is a place where we dive deep into the captivating world of entertainment with influential Latinos shaping the industry. My name is Ángel Fabián Rivera. You can also call me Ángel, and I'll be your host. You can find us in our socials at Light Camera Latino or Ángel Fabián Rivera. Today, I have the honor to have one of the best journalists, one of the best people in the world that I've ever met. Johanna Ferreira is the content director for PS Juntos. With more than 10 years of experience, Johanna focuses on how intersectional identities are a central part of Latina culture. Previously, she spent close to 3 years as a deputy editor at Hip Latina, and she has freelanced for numerous outlets including Refinery29, Oprah Magazine, Allure, InStyle, and Well Plus Good. Johanna, thank you for being here with us. How are you?
I'm good. I'm feeling really good. Like I told you, I had a holiday party yesterday, so I'm feeling really good. I'm definitely in the mood to talk about this. I'm definitely in a very community-driven place right now, so the timing's perfect.
Oh, yes, I love that. I love that you're here. Just so everybody knows, Johanna and I met this past year back in September, right? We hosted together the New Year Latino Film Festival, and the moment I met you, I feel like a good connection, but not only like a good connection, it was like positive, it was like uplifting, and I said we gotta keep this, and thank God we've kept in contact all these months, and I'm glad to call you my friend today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I always tell people that I feel like the New York Latino Film Festival experience was probably one of the coolest work experiences I've ever had, even though it was only 6 nights, back to back. And one of those reasons is I just felt so connected to everybody involved, to you especially. I feel like I walked away with friends that feel like family. And I really feel like within the first few minutes of talking to you, I was like, okay, we're going to be friends. We vibe. I felt like we were so aligned on so many levels. That lunch, we were at lunch for 3 hours.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
We met that day and we went to have lunch and we didn't even eat. We had so many great conversations about everything.
It got deep.
And I love that. I love that we could have that moment, because it's also important, because obviously for what we were going to do, and obviously, live. And it was just two people who happened to love culture and Latinos and happened to love, this industry. And we got together and chat and talk about everything. It was amazing.
Yeah, no, I love you.
I love you too. Okay, Johanna, I want to ask you something. Okay, this is a fun question. What's a Latino dish that you cannot live without?
God, there's so many. I feel like I'm gonna take you down a roller coaster with this, because I feel like I have to rank it, because there's so many for different reasons. I feel like if I had to name one, right? Because I have to name one, right? Putting me in a position where I have to name one.
Yeah.
If I have to name one, because it's you're not gonna ever eat anything else again, then it has to be rice and beans con pollo guisado, because that's it's something that I can't not go too long having, to the point where I've always been really transparent about I have GI issues, my gut health kind of dictates a lot of my lifestyle decisions. With that said, I eat a certain way when I'm home, right? I don't eat a lot of carbohydrates when I'm home. I don't eat refined foods, sugars, all that stuff. rice and beans is probably one of the worst things you could have if you have GI issues, because when you have GI issues, you're not supposed to have legumes and you're not supposed to have like heavy carbs like white rice, right? But because I'm Dominican, because I'm Latina, because rice and beans with pollo guisado is a comfort plate, I do make it at least once a month.
No, it's crazy because it's like you say, like it's one of those dishes that you're like, should I keep eating that? And then it's like, I cannot live without. Like, I grew up eating like rice and beans literally every day at my home.
Me
You know, it was
too.
like a thing. And
Yeah.
right, it's a Latino thing. Obviously, we're Caribbeans, right? Like, that's our thing, is that, and we eat that no matter what we're doing. You know, it can be a normal dinner, it can be for a party, it can be a Christmas, it can be Halloween, anything, and we eat rice and beans.
And it's cheap. It's cheap.
It is, right?
So very cost efficient. It's very practical. I'm getting my protein. I'm like, beans is a vegetable. I'm getting some vegetables in there. I usually add like a few slices of aguacate to the dish. Like, it's a protein packed dish. You know what I mean? But it's really heavy on the stomach. So it's not something I could eat every day or even like more, even weekly anymore the way that I used to. So I just always make it a point to make it at least once or twice a month. And actually, it's gotten to a point where rice and beans with pollo guisado is something I would rather cook than have at a restaurant.
Ooh, yeah.
Because
It's not the same. It's not the same thing.
Yeah. I didn't make rice and beans because I feel like you don't have rice and beans at a big party, at a potluck. So I made, anytime I'm hosting, I make arroz con guandules. Ustedes lo llaman gandules. We say guandules.
Yeah, gandule.
And I make pretty banging arroz
That's so
con
funny.
guandules. I will say that Puerto Ricans always approve of my arroz con guandules.
Okay, now I have another excuse to go to New York and try your arroz con guandules, right?
Yeah, we say guandules.
I love that.
I think the reason why
Guandules.
mine is good, like, shout out to my family. So my cousins are half Puerto Rican, right? Like, I have 3 cousins that are half Puerto Rican. So my aunt learned how to cook from her Puerto Rican suegra. So my aunt makes arroz con guandules like a Puerto Rican. So that's the recipe that
Ooh,
yeah. Yeah.
I love that. Okay, I need to try that now.
It's
Now I
always
got another
the first
excuse
thing
to
to
do
go
that.
at my parties. Like, my rice is gone in like
Yeah.
the first few minutes. Yeah. And my pollo guisado is also a hit. So I made a whole tray of pollo guisado. For Friendsgiving, I made pernil. I didn't make pernil last night because somebody had a pork allergy. So I only made the pollo guisado. So it would be rice and beans with pollo guisado, but if I had a second option, the second option would be sancocho.
I knew you were gonna say that. Sancocho. And sancocho, do you guys? I mean, we make sancocho a lot in Puerto Rico as well, and it's just root vegetables, right? For you guys too, like, it's the same thing, root vegetables, and then you pick whatever you want to add as a protein, right? We do pork as well in Puerto Rico. We do patitas de cerdo as well inside.
Yeah, Dominicans, I feel like so much of Puerto Rican and Dominican food is like kind of the same. And I think it's because a lot of Dominicans, like, you know, over the decades have migrated to Puerto Rico. So I feel like Puerto Ricans have influenced Dominican food and Dominican food has influenced Puerto Rican food.
Yeah.
The point where, like, honestly, no shade. Like, I feel like sometimes I'll see Puerto Rican Dominicans debating, like, who makes better arroz con guandules? Who makes better pasteles?
Right.
I'm like, why does it have to be a fight? Why can't we just acknowledge that we're both really good at making these dishes, point blank? The only thing I will give you guys, that I feel like is truly Puerto Rican, to the point where when I used to make it, I only used Puerto Rican people's recipes, is coquito. Like that is you guys 100%. Like, I don't think Dominicans should ever try to take credit for that. I feel like everything else is kind of like, we don't know, right? Like, okay, sure, maybe arroz con guandules did come from Puerto Rico, but I feel like we've mastered it to a level where you can't really tell. The same with like pastelón, the same with like pasteles, like the same with pernil. Like
Pateles.
Dominicans have mastered these dishes. And it's not to say that we can't master coquito, but every Dominican I know that makes banging coquito, they are using a Puerto Rican's recipe.
But I think at the end of the day, it's like you say, like we shouldn't fight about it. We should just sit down and eat everything. You make arroz con gandules, I make arroz con gandules. That's right. Everybody's arroz con gandules, and that's it, right?
That's it.
That's all we need. You know, sit down, eat, as good Latinos as we are, and just eat.
It's all love. It's all love.
Oh,
all love. Every time I go to
Right?
Puerto Rico, I feel like I enjoy the food like as much as I enjoy Dominican food.
Growing up, did you ever see yourself represented on the media in terms of like, did you see Dominicans writing about even food, right? Like, let's talk about food. We're talking about food right now. Did you ever saw like people talking about Dominican food, or you saw yourself represented in some other media growing up? And how did that make you the person you are today?
Yeah, I feel like not. The answer to that is not at all. It was to the point where, so I'm not a big baseball person anymore. I very much outgrew baseball by the time I like graduated college, right? But I feel like part of the reason why I kept watching it for so many years, because college, I was 23 when I graduated, 24 actually, 23 because I did an extra year. I was 23 when I graduated college. That's a lot of years following baseball. We're like a Yankee family. Part of the reason why I followed baseball, aside from the fact that like I kind of also just wanted to make my dad proud, because my dad loved baseball and he loved the Yankees, and it was like a cool way to like connect with him. But the other reason was it was the only form of entertainment that acknowledged Dominicans at all. It was the only time that I ever saw anybody on television that was Dominican. It was the only time I even heard the words aloud, Dominican Republic, outside of us being on the news and like Univision and Telemundo. The only time I would ever hear the words Dominican Republic on television that wasn't Spanish language was baseball. So for me, it was like, okay, cool. This is how we're being like acknowledged. This is how we're being seen in media. At the very few times I would see, and I'm talking about being a kid. I'm not talking about like being a teenager or an adult. Being a kid, this was the only form of Dominican representation I saw. I did consume, obviously, entertainment outside of music, because I feel like, which is also why I'm really big on Latin music. But I feel like as a kid, because remember that the Latin explosion of like Latin music artists crossing over to the mainstream was when I was already like in junior high school, right? So that was like 2000, 2001, Y2K. You saw like Ricky Martin, Christina Aguilera, Enrique Iglesias, Shakira crossing over to the mainstream. But before that, all the Latin music that I was consuming, that my family was consuming, I very much understood it to be music that was only being consumed by Latino people. So that was still different. Latin media was still very separate from mainstream media, because mainstream media is ultimately what dictates American culture, right? So before the Latin explosion, before I started seeing more Latina actors in film and television, what I had was baseball, to the point where there was a very brief, thank God it was brief. And it's funny because for my siblings, it was such a great experience. But me being the oldest and being in transitional ages, the hardest years of my life were 4th grade to first semester of 6th grade, because we lived in a predominantly white neighborhood that bordered Long Island. And before that, we always lived in neighborhoods that were like very diverse, right? I grew up before that point between a couple years in Corona, Queens, which when I was growing up was predominantly Dominican and Mexican. Now it's mostly like Central American. But when I was growing up, it was predominantly Dominican and Mexican. And when my parents were growing up, it was Dominican and Italian, right? So like one of the first like waves of a migration from Dominican Republic to New York was Corona, Queens. That was like a predominantly Dominican community. So I was going to school with Dominican kids, with Mexican kids, with Puerto Rican kids. And then we moved to Queens Village, which at that time, I think it still is, was predominantly Caribbean and West Indian. So there definitely were some Dominican and Puerto Ricans that I went to school with. I even remember some of them. Because one of them I was friends with her for years till I was 30. She was Puerto Rican. But there weren't a ton of Dominican and Puerto Ricans, but there was enough for me to feel normal. And everybody else was Caribbean, West Indian, Jamaican, Trinidadian, Guyanese, but there were brown and black people whose cultures were very similar to mine. You know what I mean? Caribbean culture overall, there's a lot of similarities, whether you're Latina or not. To then move temporarily to a neighborhood that was predominantly white was not only a culture shock for me, but it was a little traumatizing because it was the first time in my life where I was around people that were like, what is Dominican? What does that even mean? Where's Dominican? What is Dominican Republic?
Yeah. And meaning you was like, how do I explain, right? Because obviously you're growing up and you're also experiencing all this, and your family, they're all Dominicans, right? So you're growing up in this household some way, and then you go to this place surrounded by these kids who are different, and they're asking you questions, and it must have been hard, like, for you to answer. How do you remember, right? Like, how did you answer then that question?
I remember initially, because I've always been very outspoken. So I remember initially being really defensive. I remember the first time somebody said, what is Dominican? Like, what is that? Like, what country is that? Is the country Dominican or whatever? I remember being really defensive. And I remember being like, do you not know geography? Like, do you not know anything about like the Caribbean? Like, you don't know about anything outside of the United States? Like, I don't understand. And they were like, no, I know Mexico. They acknowledged Mexico and they acknowledged Puerto Rico. Keep in mind, this is like elementary, junior high school years, because this was 4th grade to 1 semester of 6th grade. Then thankfully we moved, right? But I remember it made me feel so invisible and so alien-like that I do feel like that's where a lot of my passion for my heritage started to stem from. And it's interesting because I had this conversation with somebody recently where I was like, I've noticed a lot of people that, not everybody, but I've noticed a lot of people that wind up working and like doing like identity work, because you could say that the work that I do as a journalist is very much tied, it's identity work, very much tied to identity. And creating content that speaks to a very specific market and demographic, right? A lot of people that tend to go into this type of work, at least from the people that I've met, have always been people that have either struggled with their identity or have found themselves having to defend their identity. This is not a bad thing necessarily, right? Like that, if anything, this is what fuels our passion and our drive and our purpose. But I feel like for me, this is when I started to have identity issues, right? Because I was like, how is it?
No, I believe that lit your spark of like, how can I work towards making this different, right? How can I make this different for other kids, not only me, right? And be like, how can we change this?
Yeah, very much so. And I think the other piece of it was, I feel like my experience as a Dominican American, I've mentioned this on other podcasts before and on panels before, is a little different in that I'm technically first gen, right? Like I'm technically, if you consider first gen being the first generation that was born here, because some people would consider me second gen. There's a lot of people look at first gen, second gen differently. But to simplify this, being a child of immigrants, a Dominican child of immigrants, my experience has been very different from most folks that I meet, right? Because most Dominican Americans that I meet from New York who are children of immigrants, not all of them, I'm saying a large majority, their parents came here as adults, right? That wasn't my experience. My parents came here in junior high school, like 12, 13, 14 old.
So they were still in that process of, changing and, discovering.
So in many ways, I tell people all the time, I'm very grateful for how they really did try to preserve not just Dominican culture. Like I could proudly say I grew up in Dominican culture, but they also made a point to raise us with like Dominican orgullo, right? Which was very important because, and I feel like Dominicans in particular hear that and they're confused because I think Dominicans, similar to Puerto Ricans, regardless of how removed you are from migration, right? We're a very proud culture, right? Like I don't often Dominican or Puerto Ricans that are not loud and proud about being Dominican and Puerto Rican.
I mean, we are, and we don't care. We say it, right?
Yeah, especially from the East Coast. I think in New York, where there's a lot of us, like even if you're a Dominican or Puerto Rican that like didn't grow up visiting or you don't speak Spanish or whatever, the orgullo is always there. With that said, I don't feel like my cousins were raised with the same degree of orgullo as we were because their parents felt pressure to assimilate whatever it was, right? But for some reason, my parents from the beginning, especially my mom, and I'm not saying that my mom is necessarily more proud than my dad because it's equal, but my mom was the one having these identity conversations with us more. Because my mom was a stay-at-home parent. She's the one that I was venting to about whatever I was experiencing in school or from my peers. She was often the one that I was going to with those things. And my mom always like down to like literally everything, down to like if people would knock our Spanish, whatever, we have this dialect because we're Caribeños and we were mixed with Black. We have African hair.
I love that you say that because, wait, before I go there, I just want to say that Dominican Orgullo, that sounds like a shirt. I don't know what you're waiting for that. I need that shirt. I'm not Dominican, but I need it.
I feel like that might exist, so I'm going to look for it, definitely.
Definitely. I mean, that shaped you, and I want to talk about that too because, things were different that day, right? But how have you, thankfully you had a mom, right? Who taught you the identity of what it is to be Dominican, right? And I feel like, because I've been in the States for 3 years, right? So I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, so the culture was different here. We're so close with the States, but at the same time, we're still in touch with our culture. But how do you feel, how important do you think it is for what your mom did to you for other parents to do to their kids growing up these days, because we see a lot about that in the media today, like not being too Latino enough or being, too Latino or what it is to be Latino, or you don't know Spanish and you're not Latino. How do you feel about that today and how has that evolved?
So I feel like, so first I'm going to answer my own experience with the not being Latino enough, and then I'm going to kind of talk about it generally speaking, like as a whole, like as a collective. I feel like for me in particular, right, what I was constantly being told, right, as someone whose parents were, I wouldn't even say like more assimilated necessarily, because like I said, like in many ways my parents are American, but the way that my parents are American is they're New Yorkers to the T. Like if my parents had like one main identity, it would be New Yorkers. And I feel like New York is such a cultural hub, and it is in many ways so inviting to Latinos and Dominicans and Puerto Ricans that them being New Yorkers did not necessarily take away from them being Dominican, right? I didn't grow up Dominican in the sense of like, I didn't grow up going to DR every summer, right? Because so much of our family was already in the States because they've been migrating here since the early 70s, right? Whereas a lot of Dominican kids that I met growing up, their parents came here like either a few years before they were born or, early 80s, whatever it was. So it's like, their parents came here as adults. So as they were growing up, they still had a ton of family there that was there or either trying to migrate here or whatever. I had all my immediate family here. The only people that I had close relationship with that were still in DR were my grandparents. But I feel like we never had the pressure to go to DR every summer necessarily because they were retired, so they were always coming here, right? Especially during the holidays, they were always here. They were here for important birthdays. Like my grandparents were very present, and I'm talking very specifically about my grandparents on my mom's side. On my dad's side, they were in the States. First they were in New York and then they were in Florida. So we actually did go to Florida a lot growing up because my mom's parents would just come to New York. They always had a place to stay. My dad's parents weren't visiting New York as much, so we were visiting Florida.
Down there.
So Spanish, I grew up speaking Spanish with my family. The issue is that I always say that I do speak Spanish. I'm just always kind of shy because I grew up.
And you speak amazing Spanish. I love it.
I feel like I'm conversationally fluent, but my grammar and the tenses sometimes tend to be off because I grew up on Spanglish. And when I say Spanglish, I feel like people interpret that to mean like, oh, my parents probably speak bad Spanish. No, they speak perfect Spanish and perfect English.
Wow.
And because of that, they're always switching. So I grew up having like half conversations in Spanish, half conversations in English. So that kind of messed me up because the English and Spanish grammar is so different, but also it made it really easy for me to cheat. So if I'm having a conversation and I'm lacking vocabulary in Spanish, I know I could just switch to English. So that's always been my weak point. But I do feel like in recent years, especially too, because this hasn't always been the case, I've become, and this has changed, right? There's been seasons in my 20s where I would talk to peers a lot in Spanish. Then there would be seasons in my 20s where I would feel rustier and I would only speak to like adults or family or like, people I felt comfortable. I feel like there's been seasons where like I don't care. And I'm like, this is an opportunity to practice. So I feel like as I've gotten older, I use any opportunity to speak Spanish, whether it's with the bodeguero, the folks at my laundromat. Like if I see a Spanish person, if you can't speak back to me in Spanish, that's fine. But if I see a Spanish person, especially somebody older, I always use the opportunity to speak Spanish. If I become your friend and I recognize that you feel comfortable speaking Spanish or you feel comfortable at least speaking in Spanglish, I always use that as an opportunity to practice, to preserve language. Like it's been very, very important to me always. Yeah.
I love that you mentioned that because I love first of all I love your story because it's so unique because you have parents who moved right when they were at their peak of of growing up and they were and it was easier for them to learn the English I believe because of that and then you grew up in a household where you didn't have family in the Dominican Republic, so that connection
I did and I still do, but they weren't like immediate. They were
not like close, right? You were not coming to the Dominican Republic to visit them. So I believe that also adds something to it because I hear a lot of stories of people that grew up coming going to the islands in the summer, visiting family there and learning about their culture just by doing that. But in your case, it was different. And I imagine even your grandparents, like their culture kind of changed or shifted, right? Like just because they were in the States now. Because I don't know about your grandparents, right? Was that a little bit of?
Yeah, no, with my grandparents, it was a little different. None of my grandparents on either side ever learned English, interestingly enough. So they like really held on to Dominican culture on both ends. So with my grandparents, it was definitely different. I feel like, and people have said this to me a lot too, my grandparents in many ways feel like a lot of my Latino friends' relationships with their parents. I have a lot of Latino friends whose parents don't speak English, and that's why their Spanish is like way more fluent than mine, right? Because they didn't have a choice. There was no Spanglish necessarily going or back and forth. But you asked me another question that
it's about the culture, the shift, the not being Latino enough, how it has changed today, right? Like how do you see it? Because I see you do a lot of writings about this, right? You write a lot about this, about Latinos, about culture. How do you feel things have changed today, when it, like comparing it to like when you were growing up and you were seeing yourself and other people in their households?
So with the not being Latino enough, it still very much exists, and it probably will always exist to a certain extent. I think the conversation has gotten a lot better. When I was growing up, it's interesting. I definitely grew up at different stages of my life, always being told by my Latino peers who were more raised in their culture than I was, in the sense of like visiting the motherland more, right? Like visiting whatever country their parents were from, at least on a yearly basis, at least in the summer. I did grow up with friends where no English was spoken at home, right? So because of that, and also because I grew up middle class, my dad's a dentist, right? And that was considered like closer proximity to whiteness as well. Right. I've always, my whole life, been told I wasn't Latina enough, my whole life. And I think that was part of my drive, because I was always like, who are you to tell me I'm not Latina enough, when in many ways I am, right? Like, Spanish is spoken in my home. I grew up mostly eating Dominican food. The only difference was that my mom was a little bit more practical, and also I think class came into this as well. My parents were people that liked to dine out. So because of that, mom was a little bit more experimental in the kitchen. So it was like, we had Dominican food most of the week, but then there would be a day where she would be like, okay, I'm making spaghettis. And like, sometimes it was Dominican style, but sometimes it was like, actually, I kind of like the way the Italians make it, so we're gonna have it like that. Like things like that. And my parents mostly had Latino friends, but they also had friends of other cultures, right? Because they speak English, so they were exposed to other cultures. So like, if my parents had, like some of their white friends, exposed them to like, hey, mashed potatoes with like meatloaf or casserole. There was definitely a period in the 90s where my mom was having fun making casserole. So because of all these factors that I just mentioned, I've always, my whole life, was told I wasn't Latina enough, and it didn't make sense to me. And I think that's also why I have so much love for Boricuas, especially New Yorkers, but Puerto Ricans in general, because I felt like I grew up around Puerto Ricans whose parents were born here. So they also felt in some ways removed from the island. So there was never any judgment from them. It was, if anything, I grew up with a lot of Puerto Ricans who spoke way less Spanish than me. I grew up with Puerto Ricans who had never gone to Puerto Rico because they were poor and they didn't have money to go to Puerto Rico. But in my mind, they were Boricua, and they were very proud to be Boricua. So I always had this understanding of like, this whole not being Latino enough, to me, made no sense. I was always like, make this make sense. If the pride is there and the desire to learn and be more immersed in the culture is there, why would you shade somebody for that? So I kind of became committed to, and I think if I like sat with my family, I think everybody would probably agree with this. I think that from that point on, living in that white neighborhood, I've been committed to being more immersed and learning more about my culture ever since. right? So from there we moved to Flushing,
Mhm.
and I started to go to school with Dominicans. I didn't grow up hearing bachata in the house because most people who grew up on bachata, because you have to understand bachata became popular like on the islands in, I guess, by the 80s, but in New York I feel like it became
Mm.
more of a thing in the
It
90s.
got, yeah, it wasn't
Yeah, my
as
parents
the same,
weren't,
yeah.
they weren't going to DR, so they weren't aware of
Yeah.
what was hot. They were still playing merengue, and they were still playing like Juan Luis. To them, bachata was like Juan Luis Guerra.
Yeah.
So I go to junior high school with all these Dominican kids, and I started studying. Okay, Frank Reyes, Zacarias Ferreira. I started learning about other aspects of Dominican culture on my own. And I brought that to my siblings, who also, in many ways, started learning about Dominican culture on their own in the sense of what we were not exposed to at home and with the family. When we talk about the collective and this whole idea of not being Latino enough, that's also, so part of my motive was lack of representation, 100%. That was
Yeah, definitely. It was there.
But the second piece was also like, who has the right to tell anybody that they're not Latino enough, right? Like, so that's where a lot of it. So I've published, I've written a lot of stories around like, you don't need to be fluent in Spanish. You don't need to look a particular way. You don't need to have even grown up around Latinos to be Latino.
Yes. And I love that you mentioned that, because I believe that that's a way to teach people today. And for example, in my experience, like growing up in Puerto Rico, right? Like for me, it was like for me, again, like this was years ago, it was you gotta know Spanish to be Latino, right? Like that was me in my mind. It wasn't until I opened my eyes and I moved to the States and I saw everybody, and I started like interconnecting with these people who are also Latinos, but not necessarily speak Spanish or not necessarily know about Mark Anthony or and I think it's about the willingness, about that spark that you're mentioning, right? Like, are you willing to learn about your culture? Do you feel close to it? Do you want to know about it? Then that's enough, It's not like I'm Latino, but I don't want to do anything to learn about it. Well, that's okay too, But I think it's also important to dig deep into it, and that's what you've been doing. And I love that you mentioned that. And I also I wanted to bring out, I'm just all around because you've been mentioning amazing things. I love that you mentioned that you were also connected with the parents of your friends more than with your friends, because you felt, like their stories were kind of like yours. And that's also very interesting, to see that, because I thought, again, like a lot, like how this started was with the Latinos, with the Caribbeans moving, and as adults and starting their families. But I forgot about, hey, these adults could have had kids, who were in the middle, like your parents, right? Of growing up, and then it was a different experience, and then you coming out of there, it was a different experience for you. And that's kind of crazy, but I love that, because that shapes you into who you are, and that makes you, and you've gone further than a lot of people, because you've been wanting to learn about your culture, learn about the whys, and your experience. That's why I always like to ask about, like, how do you start it, or how do you feel, like what inspired you, what ignited you. And your fire came when you were a kid, when you were experiencing all these things, all this injustice that was happening. And you had that spark of like fight. How do you fight back? And you've been doing that with your work, and that is amazing, and that's something to be celebrated. So I just want to say thank you for talking about and telling those stories, because you're inspiring a lot of other kids who are probably, because you're talking about New York, but imagine another family who grew up in the middle of nowhere, like Kansas, because we talk about these big cities, but what about all these Latinos that moved to these small states, small cities in the small states, and didn't have anybody to look up to, or didn't have the people, the community.
So much, it's weird, because like I don't think about it as much until I'm doing an interview where people are asking me how I got into this line of work. But so much of what I do professionally, and so much of like my purpose, kind of started as a kid. Like I started writing as a kid as a way to express my opinions and my thoughts and my frustrations. I've always been someone who has been incredibly uncomfortable with anything with injustice or anything that doesn't seem fair. And my experience with like exploring my own identity and my own culture came from, a combination of, like I said, living in a white neighborhood where I felt invisible, but also feeling like when I was in Latino neighborhoods and in Latino circles that I wasn't enough. So in many ways, it was like, okay, so how can I be enough? Let me research and immerse myself more in the culture. So it's weird because in many ways I'm also very American, right? And I'm very New York. And my identity is not everything about me, but I do feel like the older I get, the more Dominican I've become because I study my culture. Like I asked my grandmother when I was around like 17, 18, I can't remember how old I was when she moved in, teach me how to cook. Like I want these recipes in the family. And a lot of people have told me that I cook like a tia, like an abuelita, right?
But it takes initiative, right? Because it takes the willingness to want to learn. You wanted to learn something. You were like, I love your food, because I believe that your grandma cooked really good. And it was like, teach me how to do that. It's like, how do I do that? Because that's culture. That's also, it's not only culture, but it's family, right? It's like you want to cook like your grandparents at some point, right? Because we grow up eating their food, and that's part of who we are in some way.
I will say this too to the young folks or just folks, Latinos listening to this episode that feel, because I meet grown adults too that feel like they're not accepted by other Latinos or other, specific groups, whether it's Puerto Rican Dominicans. I will say that at some point you got to get over it and you have to look for that community. And I think that's also part of what helped me arrive here is pretty early on. Like I said, once we moved neighborhoods, I started looking for my people. I was like, okay, where the school, where are the Puerto Ricans in the school or whatever. And I started doing things that they were doing, right? So like, okay, what are you listening to? What music's coming out of DR right now or whatever? Where are you guys chilling, right? Like what are the spots or whatever? Going to the shows, seeing live music or whatever, just like always being in community with people that would otherwise expose me. I can give you a really simple example. I have a very romantic relationship with the Dominican salon, right? I no longer go to the Dominican salon because you've seen me, I embrace my curls or whatever. Yes. But for a very long time, because I was thinking about this recently, because I've had some project ideas. For a very long time, I convinced myself that the reason why I was going to the Dominican salon every Saturday, maybe not every Saturday, but like pretty much on a weekly basis from high school, once I had like money to go to the salon, to like at some point in my early 30s is when I finally gave it up. When I think about it, I'm like, no, because I wanted to get my hair done and I grew up in a culture that was like blow out your curls and curly hair is pelo malo, whatever. But I was recently thinking about this because I've had a project idea that I've been working on with somebody. And I was like, part of the reason why I want to work on this project is because to me, the Dominican salon was so much more than just getting. And I was thinking about it. And one of the things that I loved about going to the Dominican salon was the community, right? And I almost always made friends at the Dominican salon, right? Either with my stylist or other clients. I look back and at almost every Dominican salon that I've gone, because I've gone to many throughout my life, I've almost always made friends. Maybe I'm not still friends with them, but I've almost always made friends in the salon because of that commonality, right? But I felt like what maybe I wasn't as connected to in my family, right? So like I told you, my family's been in the States forever. I was meeting more Dominicans whose like I was even meeting Dominicans from the island that were
Yeah, like
coming
it was.
as adults. So I was being a lot more exposed to Dominican culture, even just at the salon. And for me, that was important. I was studying. I was paying attention. I was immersing myself. And so for me, there's been a lot of different types of opportunities. Even before became a journalist, where I was like, okay, like I'm not learning this from papi mami. Like, how can I learn this from my peers or from other Dominicans? Because it was important to me. And it's interesting because it was never about proving myself to anybody. I think that's important. It was never about, yo, I'm Latina enough, look, or I'm Dominican enough. It was like, I've just always understood from a pretty young age. And I think also you could probably relate to this. I'm never seen as American enough because I'm Latina, because I'm a person of color.
Because the way you look, it's no matter what happens, yes. But it also, I think it's also a really good thing too for you to have taken that initiative to learn to see yourself represent, to see other stories too, right? And see like, how does these people feel too, because you feel some type of way and you were like, am I the only one, right, who feels this way? And imagine all these people, who didn't even, because I believe you met a lot of people who didn't even know English, as Dominicans, right?
And that helped me with my Spanish. I've had a lot of friends throughout my life, even currently now, where it would be like, yo, we're going to talk in both languages because I want to practice my Spanish with you. And they would be like, I want to practice my English with you. I've had a lot of opportunities for that. But again, I feel like it's never been about proving myself to Latinos or Dominicans. I've always understood you don't know who you are if you don't know where you came from. Especially in a country that constantly others you. I could be a second generation, I could be a third generation Dominican for all people know, right? Like my grandparents could have been born here. When they see this face, it is not considered American enough. Yeah. So, and again, especially from those few years living in a white neighborhood, I quickly understood like, oh, it doesn't matter. My proximity to whiteness is so far that I need to understand who I am. I need to understand who my parents are, who my grandparents are, and where I come from. I don't really have a choice. Yeah. Right? So for me, that it's always been very important to me. So that this is why I tell Latinos too, because I meet Latinos, straight up grown adults that are like, yo, like I've never felt accepted by the community, so I don't even really chill with Latinos like that, or I do chill with Latinos, but like I feel more whitewashed or whatever it is. It's not about me judging you, because at the end of the day, if I judge you, I'm also judging your parents, and that's on you. But I don't feel like it's ever too late to try to learn and immerse yourself in your culture. Sometimes people do that when they become parents. Yeah. I've seen that a lot too, because they want to pass that culture, that history to their kids. And they're like, if I didn't learn it, then let me give you the opportunity to learn it as well. To learn it, and the choice, maybe that parent didn't have the choice, growing up. Maybe they didn't taught them. But maybe now it's the time. And I love that because, you're taking that advantage and you're saying, you're giving the opportunity to someone else to be like, okay, you are going to learn about your story, where you come from, because it's also important. And it's like you said, it's not about proving, but knowing where you come from so you know where you're going to go to. Because at the end of the day, we look how we look, and that's never going to change. No matter how white passing you look, or no matter how dark you look, they're always going to put something on you. They're always going to pin something on you. Or you look white, then why do you have an accent? Why do you have this? Even if you look white, once they see that Spanish last name, that's it. I think there's assimilation is an interesting thing because it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's all about how you approach it, right? Because I think about it from the perspective of like, if I was to move to Europe, right? To a certain extent, I would have to assimilate to what the culture is there. That doesn't mean that I need to do away with my culture as an American, as a Dominican, it doesn't mean that I need to throw that away, but there will be certain aspects to living in a new country that you do need to kind of adjust to, as simple as language. It could be as simple as language. With that said, I feel like the negative aspect of assimilation, especially considering American history, right, and how communities of color have been treated once they've migrated here, I think the bad part of assimilation is a lot of Latinos, there used to be a Spanish ban in the United States where you could not publicly speak Spanish, you couldn't speak Spanish in school. So a lot of that impacted why Latinos didn't necessarily preserve culture or feel proud about their culture, which is why I do have empathy for people who didn't grow up speaking Spanish. Even some of my cousins who, a lot of the reason why they've been less immersed in the culture, I really believe was their parents trying to protect them because of their own traumatizing experiences with discrimination and racism, right? And again, I'm really fortunate where that still wasn't the case for me, even though my parents have experienced racism and discrimination, especially when they were younger. In their mind, it was like, but that doesn't mean that I need to be less proud. And so we were raised that way. So I do think that there is a way to find that balance. I see it with my siblings, right? I see my siblings, my sister especially, intentionally buying books, like children's books around Dominican identity, around Latino identity, especially because both my siblings, they married Latinos, but they didn't marry Dominicans. So there are a lot of Latino books and Spanish language stuff, but my sister especially has made it a point to buy a lot of children's books and a lot of things for my niece that are very specifically Dominican, because she was like, since she's also Colombian and Puerto Rican, she was like, I don't want the Dominican to get lost in the sauce.
No, and that's and you brought something interesting there with being Latino, but also being specific from each country. And I want to move to another question, but this is just an amazing conversation about culture, and I love it because you know so much about it. And this is why, hey guys, this is why she's a journalist, and this is why you do what you do. You know your culture. But I wanted to bring, because people think Latinos, but they don't think about the differences inside, within it, what it is to be Latino. Like there's the Mexican culture that you said, Colombian, Puerto Rican, and Dominican. So your niece has 3 different cultures, backgrounds in her, and everything is different. At the end of the day, yes, she's gonna be Latina, right? Latina, but I love that your sister is teaching her specifically the Dominican culture, because when she grows old, she's gonna talk about it and she's gonna say, I'm also Dominican, and this is why. And that's it. And I think we also need the whys to move forward in life. And it's not about not wanting to know something because we don't want to, but because maybe it's a choice, right? Maybe it's a choice of you not wanting to learn about something, but also make it like, I know about who I am, and this is who I am, and you either take it or leave it, and you have no other choice. Accept me as who I am.
You just brought another thought to mind, because I definitely have had people in my life, especially non-Latinos, who have been in my life at different periods of time that didn't understand why I went into this line of work. And they were like, I've had people kind of downplay what I do, like, oh, whatever, you got, they'll list a few Latino actors or celebrities or successful people. What more do you want? What more representation do you want? Like, I believe you do this for a living or whatever. Or they would almost, in full transparency, a lot of the people that have been offended by the work that I do throughout my life have been white Americans that have been like, oh, so like, and then I'll show the research and they'll be like, oh, who cares that you guys are you trying to threaten me by telling me that Latinos are going to become the minority majority, or that the country's going to be mostly Latino? And then they wouldn't understand this pride, or they'll see like, the Latino pride. Maybe there's a program, maybe like an actor, maybe John Leguizamo, somebody says something, it would be like, oh, what's up with you guys and this pride? And the reason why I think this pride with anybody honestly, especially communities of color living in the States, is important is because when you come here or you're raised here, especially depending on where you were raised, if you were not raised with enough people that look like you, that share culture with you, you are conditioned to be ashamed of who you are. And I think that's the piece that people don't understand. If you are a white, and I say this all the time, like, there's nothing wrong with being white. We're living in a weird time where, like, if you are not of a minority group, you're supposed to feel bad about that, right? Like, if you're a man, you're supposed to feel bad about being a man. If you're straight, you're supposed to feel bad about being straight. If you're white, you're supposed to. I don't agree with that. But what people don't understand is that when you're raised to feel shame about or in surroundings where people make you feel ashamed or less of because of what you are, whether it's the color of your skin, your ethnicity, being Latino. In many cases for me, it was being Latina, but also being Dominican, because a lot of people treat Dominicans like we're like at the bottom of the Latin American food chain, right? And I do think a lot of that comes from anti-Blackness, if I'm being very frank, right? But that shame, you carry that with you. You know how many times, not so much anymore because I don't give a shit, but you know how many times I have yeah, no, the older I get, the less I care about these things. But for many years, my loudness brought me so much shame. Like, anytime someone would let me know that I spoke loudly, anytime somebody, as somebody who grew up in Spanglish, I always make a joke, like, I am fluent in English, but I always make a joke that, like, my English and my Spanish is not great because I grew up with it, like, intermingled, right?
With the mix, being
the mix of both. I feel like a lot of Latinos that grew up with both feel similarly. I've had a lot of people say this to me, but then I'll have non-Latino fix my pronunciation or laugh at me or tell me I don't know how to speak English, or like, you know, I pronounce things weird. I've always struggled with certain names, right? Names that are hard to phonetically pronounce. And so I would always ask people in advance, like, can you please let me know how to pronounce your name, especially if I'm doing anything work related, like a panel or something like that, because not every panel I've done, it's been just Latinos, right? You know, so can you sometimes it's just been POCs. So it's like, yo, can you please let me know how to pronounce your name so that I can do it properly? There was a point, because I used to have a podcast, where somebody, let's say I thought somebody had a hard name to pronounce, I would ask them, and then in my private time, I would record it on audio and I would listen to it over and over before we got on the podcast. Because what I didn't want to do was mispronounce. So all these things, like I felt shame around my hair for a very long time as somebody with curly hair, you know, different things. So it's like, if you are in environments where people are making you feel less of, or even maybe in some cases it's not shame. Maybe it's like, you know how many of us grew up being told you ain't doing that? I definitely had people
all the time
tell me, you're not going to be able to do that because you're Latina, you're brown, you're Dominican, all this stuff. And that's where I think the pride and the celebration is so important. Because when you do take pride in who you are, right, regardless of what your culture, race is, that does make it easier for you to confidently navigate this world.
It's who you are. At the end of the day, that's never going to change. You know, your background, the way you look, the way you are, who you are, that's never going to change. And we have to come, and I think that's one of the hardest things to do in life in general for people, right? Like, be in sync with who they are and not try to fit in, you know. And also being Latino, being layered there, it's also a different thing because of that, because even that you grew up with the English so close to you, you felt like, oh my God, like, am I doing it wrong? Like, these people are judging me or this and that. So imagine people, right, like, who only spoke Spanish and moved to these places and, not even tried because they were afraid to. And sometimes people ask like, oh, why don't you learn English? And it's because there's shame behind all that. Me,
Right.
growing up, like even being in Puerto Rico where we're so close with English, like I felt so judged all the time. Like speaking English with my friends, it was so hard. Like literally to the point that sometimes they made me cry, and it was like I don't want to speak English no more. And it wasn't until I went to maybe high school ish, college, where I felt like, oh my, I'm just gonna speak English. If I have an accent, I don't care. I'm just gonna be myself, speak the way I know how to speak it, and just do it. And it's not until that moment where you're gonna break that barrier with yourself, and be like, I'm just gonna go in the world, look at Sofia Vergara, she had the way, she spoke that way, she didn't give a fuck, and she did it, and I always like to bring that example because it's like, that's her. Yeah, that's her, that's her accent. You either take it or leave it, and that's never gonna change. And at the end of the day, like we speak two languages, it's like, how hard that is. Like not everybody can do that, and you should be proud of that. You should be proud of knowing how to speak in two languages. I love seeing people that when they tell me like, oh, I know 5 languages, 6 languages, and I'm like, how the fuck, it's not that easy. I love this conversation, Johanna, because this just shows and represents the work that you do, and your passion for what you do. And there's no better way to know or to get to know the work that you do with knowing who you are, right? And because who you are is what you write in some type of way, right? I love, you always bring yourself into your writings. And I wanted to bring, I had a lot of questions for you, but we're running out of time, and this has been an amazing conversation about culture. But I just want to know, like, how do you feel, like, going back to Johanna being a kid, not seeing the representation enough, and Johanna growing up and seeing all this, like, that, like, lights that got lit, right? And you grew up, how do you feel today, like, the mainstream media have evolved in terms of Latinos, and specifically music? Because I know you do a lot of like music, like you talk a lot about music and you write a lot about music. How do you feel that has changed today, and how is moving forward?
I honestly feel like, first off, representation when it comes to entertainment has significantly progressed when it comes to Latino representation, right? And I think I understand the frustrations that folks both in and out of the business have, where they still feel like it's not enough. It's not. It's definitely still not enough. But I do think that it would be unfair for us not to acknowledge the significant progress that has been made, right? There are a lot more Latinos in film, television than I ever saw growing up, like I told you. In terms of music specifically, we've always been doing our thing, especially when it comes, even outside of Spanish language music. But when referring to Latin music in particular, I think that, kind of going back to what you said about Sofia Vergara, I think it really speaks to the power of orgullo, authenticity, and resilience that Latinos were very much like. There's a lot of artists, Bad Bunny, J Balvin, Karol G. There are so many artists that were like, I'm not, Daddy Yankee, I'm not doing English music. Like, I'm doing Spanish music. And because they kept at it and they believed that, first of all, they weren't creating music for the whole world, right? It wound up, a lot of these Latin music genres wound up becoming global at some point, right? Because other people were able to recognize the values. The Spanish language is a language that is recognized in a lot of countries in the world, but also in general. Like, I definitely listen to artists, and I listen to French artists, I listen to Italian artists. I don't need to necessarily understand the lyrics. We want the music itself. I'm somebody who also listens to wordless music and instrumental music, if I'm being honest, because I feel so connected to music that for me, sound alone could be enough to like emotionally impact me. And then lyrics just take it to another level, right? So I think a lot of
Yep.
people feel that way, which is why I think Spanish language music resonates on a global level. But it took us having that pride and that belief in ourselves for it to become mainstream to the point where like now Latin music artists don't need to worry about crossing over to English to be successful on a global level or even in the States.
Yeah.
You know, so one of the things that I think is really important when we're talking about media and covering representation is I've published them myself, the think pieces about lack of representation and why that's a problem and why that could be harmful, but also taking whatever opportunities we can as Latino journalists who have the opportunity to work at some of these mainstream media companies, to use that opportunity to highlight what we are doing and highlighting specific folks, whether it's celebrities or not, because sometimes it's people in politics, sometimes it's activists or whatever, sometimes it's folks in healthcare, whatever it is, highlighting their stories to let people know, hey, we are doing amazing things. Yes, it's not enough. Yes, we still need to be represented more, but highlighting the folks that are in these industries that are making a huge impact in their industries and on a global level. So one of the things that I love doing is I love covering Latin music artists because I think it's really important, and I think it has very much impacted American culture, even outside of music itself. So much of what and you know, I feel like for the past couple of years, everybody's been using Bad Bunny as an example, and he's not the only example.
It is.
But I think he's an important example of someone who was like, yo, I'm Puerto Rican. My music is for the community. If other people like it, dope, but it's going to be in Spanish. Yeah. I feel like in many ways, he's inspired other people to navigate the industry that way. And that's why I think he's such a great example, you know? And I think it's important. I think that's an important story to tell.
I love that you mentioned that, because I think, you know, going back to, for example, Despacito, when Despacito started, you know, nobody knew about that. Daddy Yankee, you know, I went to London and people were singing to it, and they didn't even know Spanish. They were just singing to it, you know? And I felt so proud. I was like, this is amazing, you know, how something in a different language, how a song in a different language is making people get together and create community in a different way. And that's the big thing that Bad Bunny has done. Like you said, you know, he's doing his thing. He's like, if you want to listen to it, you listen to it, but I'm gonna keep doing what I want to do, which is just do my thing for my people in my language, you know, because it's so interesting that in his music, he speaks very Puerto Rican too, you know, and a lot of people, I have a lot of Mexican and Colombian friends. They're like, what's that even mean? And I'm like, the way we speak in Puerto Rico, that's just us. And I love that he can transcend these words or these phrases or these stories to other people and tell about who we are, you know, about our culture. And that, at the end of the day, is what we're doing. And we should celebrate that, you know, and no matter, you know, where you come from in Latino area, community-wise. It's not what we want, but we should celebrate what we have now, because we didn't have this a couple of years ago. And in the way to move forward, we need to acknowledge what we have today. And I think that's very important to know, and for people to understand that we've come so far, you know, and we're not going to stay here, right? We know it's not going to stop here, but we're going to keep moving and keep working. And I thank people like you that are highlighting these voices, that are highlighting these stories, because I feel it's very important. And I don't know if you take time to like sit down and see and acknowledge the work that you do, the important work that you do. you do an amazing work. So I really want to thank you for that, for doing the work that is needed, and you're connecting a lot of community.
And I think the other part of it too is like, when, let's just take the Latin music example, Bad Bunny, all of those things. Representation humanizes us. And in a way that I think a lot of people who are more represented kind of take for granted, right? Like when you don't see yourself represented in the media, in film, in television, in any of the content that you're consuming, it makes you feel not just othered, but like, and I know we use the phrase not seen often, but like if people really paid attention to how significant it is for people to feel seen, right? Like feel like you exist and you matter, and other people in this world exist and relate to you and your experiences as well. Oh my God, one of the reasons why I became a writer was because of Julia Alvarez and Junat Diaz. I was like, oh snap, so Dominicans could be professional writers in the States too? Cool, maybe I can do that. Had I not had those examples, I don't know if I would have been brave enough to pursue this, especially during a time where there were not a lot of Dominican folks who were working in media when I went into media, when I was in college. Mm-hmm. I think it also, representation humanizes us, and it normalizes our experiences and our stories. And that's a lot more important than I think a lot of people realize.
It is beautiful. And that's the whole point of this podcast as well, is to bring people like you, who are making a change and sometimes are not getting and yes, we don't do this because we want the credit. We don't do this because we want the acknowledgement, but sometimes we need that to continue the work that we do. And this is the point of this, to celebrate people like you. And if I haven't told you enough, I keep wanting to say thank you, because, you inspire. And you inspire me. You inspire me in many ways. Like when I met you, like I was like, this girl has a lot of passion in her. And that passion, it's going to transcend to other kids who will want to do this, someday, and going to see themselves in you, like you saw yourself, in someone else. And that is the beauty of what we do, it keeps transcending, it keeps going through generations, and you are making a difference. So thank you, Johanna, again for this. Thank you for this conversation. And before we wrap this up, I have a fun part of it. I wanna bring like a game, like a trivia game. It's something simple. Okay, so we got entertainment. Are you ready for the question? Let's see. Okay, so entertainment is the highest grossing Latin singer of all time.
Of all time? Like not right now, just
of all time.
That is so hard.
I'm gonna give you 3 people, okay?
Okay.
It's either Jose Iglesias, or Luis Miguel.
I think I'm gonna go with Jose.
It's Julio Iglesias. It's Julio Iglesias.
Jose has so many songs that are still recognized globally that I was like, definitely Jose. Yeah. But I guess Julio Iglesias also has.
Yeah. Okay, you got entertainment again. Okay, so the next question is, which Latina artist became the first female to have a song simultaneously top the Billboard Hot 100 and the Billboard Latin charts in 2017? Cardi B, Karol G, or Becky G?
I feel like it's Cardi B.
Yes, that's it. It's Cardi B.
Yeah,
it's Cardi B.
I know Karo's broken a lot of records, but not by 2017. Mm-hmm. Definitely not.
Which animated movie featuring a Mexican family celebrates Dia de los Muertos?
Every Latino should know it's Coco.
Right? Ding, 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 ding. I love that. I want you to tell an advice for all these young Latinos who want to pursue a career in journalism, specifically in writing, writing about anything, in that term. And why should they do it?
I mean, I don't know if I would advise people to pursue a career in what's known to be traditional journalism, just because I feel like it's changing day by day with, social media impacting it, AI impacting it. I feel like the industry is changing so much that you can go to college to study journalism and graduate and it's a completely different field. That's what happened with me. I went in wanting to pursue media for print, and by the time I graduated, I went straight into digital. Right? So I don't know if I would, and this is not to discourage people to pursue media or journalism, because we still need media and we still need journalists. But I think because it's changing so much, I would challenge people that want to go into media because they want to be storytellers to think of ways that they can do that on their own, especially because we're living in a time where everybody is, in my opinion, sadly, but mostly consuming social media, right? Like, it's kind of mind-boggling, but so many people don't read news. So many people don't read at all. So many people are getting their information from social media. So I think there's so many ways that you can put your writing and your storytelling out there where that can help you if you do want to pursue journalism, or you just want to be someone who's known for storytelling or for interviewing. Like, I think podcasting is, a lot of people think that podcasting is oversaturated and everybody's doing it and you're not going to be able to stand out, this, that, and third. And yet, so you're launching this podcast. I think so many people have so many different things to offer that I think as long as your offering is unique to you, I think that still holds a lot of weight. And being able to have a podcast that draws in audiences and is engaging. So I think podcasting is really important. I think there's also other ways to still write stories. Like, I was just having a conversation recently with somebody about the impact of Substack and newsletters. And I subscribe to a lot of newsletters till this day, even from influencers that I appreciate their stories and their voice and what they have to offer. I think that, I was talking to somebody about how I've written 3 book proposals already, and I've been in talks with publishers for years. I still haven't been able to publish something, and somebody was challenging me about self-publishing, and I was like, no, it doesn't count. It's not as respected. At the end of the day, if the goal is for you to get your story out, sometimes self-publishing is a great route to take. So I think my biggest piece of advice for writers and anybody who wants to be a storyteller is don't limit institutions to how you need to get your stories out there. There's so many things now that we have access to that allow us to put our stories out there on our own. This is advice that I should be taking myself. I just haven't really carved out the time for it. But I really do feel like every writer should have their own platform. Even if you are, obviously you have to talk to your job and there can't be conflict of interest or whatever. But I think every writer should have their own platform or platforms for putting their stories out there, and not just depending on, corporations or media companies or publishing agents or whatever it is to get their stories out there. We have a lot more power and access to do it on our own, as you're doing.
I loved it, and thank you for saying that. Challenge, that I think it was stuck with me was challenge yourself. It's don't be like everybody else, right? Like, what can you bring to the table? And that's the kind of work that you do that's represented there. And I love that you said that you're saying this as you're actually taking the advice yourself. Hey, wait. But it's very important to bring yourself into whatever you do in life. That's what's gonna move you, and that's what's gonna let you move forward. And I love that. Challenge yourself, be who you are, and do what you do because you love it. And thank you for sharing that advice.
It's
How
scary.
can people connect
Don't
with
get
you?
me
Where can people
wrong.
find you? Where can people find your work? Yeah, it is scary. It is scary. It is. Every time, like, even like for me to do this podcast was a lot of like, will people listen to this? Will I be able to make it? How am I going to interview people? I've never done this before. How can I do this? Like, and you know what? At the end of the day, it was like, let me just sit down and do it. Let's do it. It's the only way you're going to know if you're good at it. That's the only way. So again, where can people find you? Where can people see your work? And how can people connect with you?
I'd say like one of the best ways to find me is on Instagram. My handle is Cup of Johanna. So it's cup_of_Johanna. And the reason why that's my handle is because I feel like people have always kind of seen me as someone who like gives, not even just gives advice, like, but I've always carved out space for like honest conversation. And I feel like people enjoy having conversation with me. And so I always thought of that phrase cup of Joe, and that was taken. So I took cup of Joanna. So that's like probably the best place to find me and to see what I'm up to. Because I do share a lot of the work that I do at my job, but also other things that I've done on the side. I share a lot of my perspectives. So that's honestly the best place to find me.
Beautiful. Thank you, Johanna. Real quick, if you could have a movie about your life, what would be the title?
I already know it. I feel nervous sharing it because it is a title of a real movie that I want.
Oh, okay. Okay, so thank you, Johanna, again for being here. This was Lights, Camera, Latino, the podcast. Remember to find us at our Instagram as Lights, Camera, Latino, or my handle, Angel Fabian Rivera. And before we go, I always like to end up with this. When life knocks you down, levántate con más fuerza. Keep fighting. Hasta la próxima. Thank you, Johanna, for being here with us.
Thank you so much. So honored to be here. Thank you for considering me as one of your guests, for celebrating and honoring my work. That means so much. I'm also your biggest advocate and your biggest supporter. So I'm always going to be here cheering you on the sidelines and supporting you in any way I can. So like I've told you before, if you need guests, I'll bring you guests.
Thank you so much. We are family, and I love that. And we connected so quickly, and this is going to be hopefully a relationship that goes for years or forever, if I might say.
It better be
so
forever.
Thank you for that, Johanna. And thank you. Please. So thank you a lot for being here at this, episode. And we'll see you in the next time. I'm definitely going to bring you back.
Oh my God, yes, please. Please do.